Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Kaizen Central from Manufacturing TV. I think it's safe to say that this has been a very strange week in the world of business. We had the extraordinary spectacle of a British cabinet applauding and laughing along with a prime minister who was blaming greedy businesses for failing to deal with problems that he and his party had said would never happen. Not so much party conference, perhaps, as pantomime, with business cast as the ugly sisters, Boris Johnson as Snow White, the seven dwarfs arguably in the front row clapping. Anyway, here to discuss this, I'm delighted to say, is a very good friend to British manufacturing, good friend of mine of many years standing, Terry Scuoler, former chief executive of EEF, which of course today is Make UK, and is now chief executive of the Institute of Export and International Trade. And I have to say, it's going to be a subject we might very well discuss, trade and exports, Terry, because that is obviously something very much of great interest to us in the room at the moment. But let's just address this issue of that speech by Boris Johnson. I thought it was quite extraordinary, and I don't know whether you agree, but it felt completely out of touch with the reality of life in business today in the UK.
Nick, many thanks for the invitation this evening, and it's a pleasure to join you and reconnect with you. I had a warm, glowing relationship with you and your team beforehand, so it's great to reconnect. I was puzzled. I was beyond puzzled, Nick and colleagues, when I read the headline this morning. We business leaders, British industry is, I quote, drunk on cheap labour, drunk on access to cheap labour. Now, yes, I think we have benefited, of course, from migration. We have benefited from time to time from the relative surfeit of labour that is brought. But I thought that was insulting. I thought it was absolutely insulting to British business and British business leaders. And just in preparation for our debate this evening, I went back to the industrial strategy that I was, with others, instrumental in creating back in 2017, which came out very end of the year, early of the following year. And I looked at some of the issues that we were addressing there. The digital revolution, climate change, going to net zero, albeit perhaps not as strongly as we are now, the energy revolution, the future of mobility and the needs of an ageing society. And I looked then at what have we done since then. And Nick, I looked at Innovate UK, the British Business Bank, the British Growth Fund, the 40 billion that has gone to UKEF, the export strategy. And then when one actually reflects on it, they all came out, were all put in place, and all have been implemented, of course, in the previous regime, i.e. pre-December of 19. And I think that gives me some cause for concern. I think as you and I had an exchange only some hours ago, I do not think that our current Prime Minister is anti-business. He just does not, in my view, understand business. I think that is a challenge we face. I think it's potentially a double challenge in that through the period of Greg Clark, through the period of Vince Cable, which you and I, individuals that you and I knew well and worked with, we had individuals who regarded intervention as something, yes, it had to be in its place, but the word intervention, perhaps translate that into support for British industry, for key sectors, for the key issues of technology and skill, was very much part of the day-to-day job. And I am concerned, yes, but concern needs to translate into action. And I'm concerned that the perhaps overly free market, laissez-faire credentials of even our relatively new business secretary here. I could go on forever on this subject, as you well know, but I'm just going to offer a very minor anecdote. I remember having a meeting. A courtesy was paid to me by Sajid Javid when he was business secretary. He was giving a speech and I was introducing him at a speech. And there was not one word or not two words in that speech that I believed were critical. Industrial strategy, call it industrial policy, but the term we used at that point was industrial strategy. And I said to him, come on, let's have at least a reference to industrial strategy in this. And of course, he refused to do so. I put £20 on the table from my pocket. Now, that is a big investment for a Scotsman, as you know. I said, Sajid, here is £20 jokingly. If you will at least mention these two words, which we have a British industry, are very anxious to hear. Of course, he did not accept. It would be nonsense if he had done. But the point, I think, was being made that just industrial strategy was not on the agenda. Now, there's some good things happening here. We're going to pass on to some individuals here who are very key to our sector that we have such passion for. On balance, I think it would be crass of me not to say that our current Prime Minister, with the agenda of getting Brexit done, coming straight out of the run-up, rather, to getting Brexit done, with the trade agreement, with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and then the pandemic in March of last year, has had a huge amount in his in-tray, and it is only fair to recognise that. It is only fair to recognise the 400 billion of deficit that we have now created. Will that limit industrial support in terms of financial support for the industrial and wider service sector? Question, I think it's a valid question. Yes, there are reasons for mitigation here, but if one ignores the industrial sector, its support and its needs, its infrastructure needs, its skills needs, its technology needs, its growth needs, its exportability at its peril. And I hope our government does not do so. I will pause for breath.
Well, all I can say is I'm delighted that you actually managed to hang on to your money, Terry. That is a positive that came out of the experience. You mentioned that word intervention, and I only when you mentioned it in just then did I realize what a strange word it is. Because intervention is a word that is always used when it comes to the relationship between government and business. And it is used in a way that suggests that government has to get involved when there's something wrong with business. And as you would say, they had an intervention, because things weren't going too well. Somebody had to intervene. It's not about intervention at all. As you said, it's about support. And it's almost as if we've got decades of institutionalized false memory, or maybe it's actually a correct memory of what it was like back in the 60s and 70s. But it's entirely inappropriate for where we are today. It's almost as if we would all benefit just from perhaps changing some of the language we use.
Yeah. I do not like the word intervention. And as I said it, I'm almost uncomfortable as I use the term. And I go back to a point in time when a business minister called Michael Heseltine said, and you will remember, I will intervene before breakfast, intervene before lunch, intervene before dinner. Absolute nonsense. So let us move away from this. But this support is very much the word, and that support needs to be backed by action, and where appropriate, it needs to be backed by government funding. And surely there is no other way in terms of Britain securing again, continuing to secure, depending how one looks at one's current economic history, our place in the world without key supply chain levers of policy being identified and to a measurable degree being supported morally, physically by finance, by government. And I think, to be fair, the growth paper that came out by Rishi Sunak in March flagged up a number of those: infrastructure, skills, innovation. It used to be called place, community. Now, of course, it's called levelling up. Yes, so I think this government understands what the issues are, to what extent it is motivated and has the mindset to support it as we would wish. I do not know. The jury is...
Yeah, I agree. It's you talked then of the deficit that was run up, the 400 billion, the pandemic cost. It's interesting, actually, that I'm not certain, and let's not stray too far off course, but I just want to point out that they're talking about government finances at the moment, about government borrowing levels, all that, all being quite even, Stephen, at the moment, and things are quite. What happened to that? Well, we all know where the money went. Where did it come from is a different issue. And this is really where I fall out with the Chancellor, because he says we must not pass the cost of this on to the next generations lying ahead. We must deal with it now, which means to him that he's just not going to spend any money or not going to invest anything. Whereas, of course, if he doesn't invest or help business invest and sort of in that fundamentally important way that other countries are doing so strategically, so cleverly, so smartly, setting up their industrial sectors for success. If he doesn't do that, there aren't going to be any high value jobs for those future generations to have. And I want to start bringing other people's views into this, because I may, you know me, I get very wound up about issues like this, but it seems to me that it's a category error to re-enter an age of austerity to pay for the last year's terrible pandemic. And that is going to be a much greater cost to future generations than some investment now with a clear-headed, cooperative support structure that government can achieve. And as Terry told us, the 2017 industrial strategy would have achieved and started to achieve with manufacturing and the rest of the business sector. So please, other people, jump in here and stop me frothing at the mouth, because I'm afraid I get carried away with these things.
Nick, the journalist in you is coming through loud and clear.
That's not well, it may be opinion journalism. I think it's more rabble rouser. And I think if you gave me a soapbox, I'd stand on a street corner, or I'll get down to Speaker's Corner and have my say. Maybe that's where I belong. Okay, please, anybody who wants to say anything, just either put your hands up. Adrian, thank you, or use the little hand up button if you can find it. Adrian, good evening to you. Industrial photographer par excellence.
Oh, thank you, Nick. I would think that the country is pretty skint by now. So if the Chancellor wants to invest something, then surely he's going to have to borrow money from somewhere, which just adds to the 400 or so billion that's already been borrowed. So that puts him in a sticky position, doesn't it? So what do we do from, taking that into consideration?
That's a very good point. And maybe just picking up something that Nick said, we have borrowed 400 billion. And I have seen, as we have all seen, Rishi Sunak being very comfortable at the start of the pandemic, as we borrowed 100 billion, then 200 billion. We saw him becoming much less comfortable as we got to 300 billion. And indeed, the challenge that he was putting towards his Prime Minister and our Prime Minister. And I think what I would say is, yes, none of us want tax increases, but we're increasing taxes by about what, 15 billion a year in terms of that which we've experienced recently in terms of NI. To save the NHS, and no doubt partly to help pay down some small part of this huge deficit. Interest rates appear to be rising, and that, of course, will cost us as a nation a lot more money. There is mitigation here for this government. Boris Johnson cannot go on spending. If he does, he has to borrow more. And at some point, his major stakeholders, as Chancellor of the Bank of England, will become very, very concerned. Maybe that points, of course, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, to therefore what money we've got, we need to spend it wisely. And surely a wise priority is the sector, the industrial sector that we represent.
I would argue that, and there is a very strong body of thought that says that there is almost a conspiracy among the political parties to discuss the nation's finances in the same way as we discuss our household finances. That actually a sovereign nation with its own currency can print money And that is exactly where that money came from, that 400 billion. It wasn't borrowed, it was printed by the Bank of England and used to stimulate the economy and pay for all, that is public money which fell into the system through the government, but the Bank of England gave them the money. It doesn't make her skin, it doesn't have to be paid back. It's our money, and it's the only way we'll have to pay for it is in terms of inflation, and that means higher taxes have to be used to reduce inflation. That's modern monetary theory. We're not here to discuss that, but it is worth investigating, because I don't believe we're skint. We're a sovereign nation. We're very far from skint. We have our own currency and we're in charge of it. But as I say, that's perhaps a wholly different issue. Richard Hagan, very good evening to you.
And good evening, Nick. I thought I was going to Preston, and I'm not. I've got too many dates in my diaries. It's just madness. I'm just wanting to play devil's advocate. Manufacturing is strong at the moment. Manufacturers are doing well through the crisis. Is it just the government are looking at in industries like ours and sort of going, they've got money, let's squeeze them some more, which is exactly what you said, Terry, about the 15 billion. It's in NI, so our employees don't understand it. It's just business owners that are going to obviously take the pain. They are looking for a clawback, and they're looking for it quick before the next election.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting point there. I think we, as well as government, have been pleasantly surprised at how well British industry has coped with the pandemic. And coming out of the pandemic and the recent growth figures, whether it be PMI or indeed the last quarter's GDP growth, just over 5%, 5.1%, I think that has pleasantly surprised government, the Bank of England, and has completely knocked to one side their more modest forecasts and projections. So yes, I think British industry is performing well. We've got some very stellar examples of that, some world-leading sectors, and perhaps are represented in the debate this evening. But just the best way to get out of a debt crisis, notwithstanding Nick's comments here, is of course to grow your way out of it in terms of paying back debt. At some point that debt will have to be repaid, and therefore funding, supporting the growth in terms of startups, high-tech businesses, rapidly growing companies, and indeed maintaining traditional businesses as well, what we call foundation industries. Let us never forget the foundation industries, which are still there supporting many of our communities, all need to be supported in various degrees and measures.
So what worries me...
I'm sorry, beg your pardon, Richard, please carry on.
So what worries me is, as a leader, one, you need empathy and perspective. They've not given empathy today. They certainly haven't got perspective. But the main one for me is to have my team follow me. I need to win the hearts and minds of them. And what they've now achieved, our government, is almost alienated manufacturers and says, we're not supporting you. That means manufacturing isn't going to sort of want to work with them. Nobody wants to be told. We all want partnerships. We all want to feel valued. What they've now done is not valued manufacturing, which I think is a big, big mistake.
I agree with you. A very famous German banker once said that if a nation, and by a nation he meant if its industry and its business leaders have confidence in their government, they will have confidence in themselves. Helmer Schlacht, in fact, was the German central banker at the time, and you're right. And I just look at the relative. No, sorry, I'm being diplomatic, and let me not be diplomatic to a group of allies and colleagues. The breakdown in engagement between industry and government when Boris Johnson came to power was noticeable, and it is felt not just by business leaders themselves, but it is felt by their representative bodies, whether it be the former Engineering Employers Federation, which I led, EEF, now Make UK, whether it be the ongoing war, the ongoing conflict that Boris Johnson has with the CBI, and I could go on. That trust has been, let's not say broken, but very severely dented.
Yeah, interesting that Nadhim Zahawi was trying to be very emollient today after the conference. I think that you'll see some bridges being rebuilt, or at least some attempt being made to do so. John Hardwick from the Northwest Manufacturers Alliance. Very good evening to you.
Good evening, Nick. Nice to be back here after a few weeks away. Various things were going through my mind over the previous discussions, but I guess one thing that struck me over the last couple of weeks was looking at the issue over the HGV drivers and some of the barriers to having HGV drivers, and their complaint about the infrastructure, about the working conditions. And it struck me that wasn't something that was easy for the road haulage companies to solve, because they're in a competitive situation. There's a shared service there. So it reminded me that, in terms of where should the government intervene, in inverted commas, or support, it's in the gaps for me. It's in those gaps where it can't be left to capitalism. It can't be left to market forces, because there's a infrastructure requirement that needs government policy. Now, I'm not sure that the truck stops and the shower facilities and everything is an appropriate example of that. But then I go back to my basic economic theory about where does economic growth come from, and it comes from participation, so getting employment up. It comes from training. So where's the really meaty investment and policy and strategy for training to support manufacturing? It's in technology, appropriate use of technology, and where's the strategy roadmap for technology that's supporting manufacturing? So I'm not pro-interventionism everywhere, but it's the infrastructure, and it's in the gaps between the organizations and between the industries where we need that support and policy from government. So in terms of bang for the buck and where should they be spending the taxpayers' money, for me, that's where we should be putting it, in that bit that can't be managed by the industrial sectors themselves.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, Terry, please go ahead.
Another very interesting point, and this, much of what John related to was elements of which were about infrastructure. And maybe I've got a question, Nick, for some of our colleagues around the metaphorical table, and that is, a lot of money is being spent in infrastructure at the moment. Now, when I look at HS2, Crossrail, Boris Johnson's plan, if it still is a plan, to bridge the Irish Sea. Now, HS2 is £110 billion. Are we getting the right linkages to the ports? Are we getting the right linkages to the airports? Are we getting the right hubs created? Are our A, B minor linkage roads in the shape that they should be? So I just wonder if this money is being spent where it should be spent. And the other thing I'd criticise Boris for is, of course, high wage, high growth. Fine. I think we're in a situation where we're experiencing high wage. Whether or not it will lead to high growth, once again, the jury is out.
Yes, I take the point about John. I thought that point was very well made about that need for the investment in the margins, in the gaps, as you say. It's almost as if nobody cares about the public, the hidden places where truckers, for instance, just going back to the HGV issue, where truckers have to frankly, live a pretty awful life on the road. I was up at Thurrock Services the other day, stopped for a coffee on the way back from Suffolk, and noticed a driver more or less having to feed himself on the edge of his, on a little ledge on his truck, and body washing, because there was, the facilities were just so rubbish. And I thought then, and that was before this debate kicked off, so it was it was sort of a little bit of first-hand experience. But I think you're absolutely right, in my judgment, about the fact that if there is a guiding philosophy, and this goes back to what Terry was saying about that, what the German central banker said, if you can sense a guiding philosophy, a sense that those bits in the middle are being taken care of, then yes, the business will have the confidence to as well to supplement that investment. But if they see that everywhere along the line they're expected, without any sense of directional guiding philosophy that they're being expected to throw some cash in this direction when all of a sudden a decision may be taken tomorrow, which means they should have put it in that direction. It's little wonder that they won't put any cash anywhere. And so that's why I think that the fundamental moment in this was the scrapping of the Industrial Strategy Council. That was the weather vane that told us exactly which way the wind was going. And I think really started the chill between government and industry. And it's a terrible, terrible shame. And I'm not certain quite how we get out of it without what, frankly, is a continuity Brexit cabinet having to do a sharp handbrake turn. And they don't look ideologically like they're in a mood to do so.
Yeah.
Who's got some thoughts and who else would like to speak? Lovely to see Stephen Barr joining us, old friend of Terry's, I'm sure. I think Stephen may be on public transport. It may be difficult for him to speak, so I won't put him under any pressure. But
maybe just a comment, if I may. It's important that we're balanced here, and there's almost a perverse compliment here in that Boris Johnson will drive the levelling up agenda. He'll drive the Brexit agenda, which clearly he did get Brexit done, and business can look after itself because business is a tough old boot. It's performed well in the past. It will always perform well in the future, and we'll let them get on with it. Now, believe it or not, there is some form of backhanded compliment in that, whether or not it is intended or not. Now, put that to one side. It may the obverse of that may be that he just does not understand what we do and how we do it. And I think two colleagues contact me today. One was from Lincolnshire and said at the back end of the harvest, which is now under pressure as we go into October, field hands for picking potatoes are being offered £30 an hour to work in the fields. And there is a major freight company looking for lorry drivers offering starting salaries of £62,000 a year. Now that may well be absolutely critically important and worthwhile for some of those traditionally lesser paid people in our country who deserve more money. But of course, is it sustainable in terms of keeping businesses going to achieve the growth that we need? Therefore, Boris Johnson's high wage may fit in with the levelling up agenda, the promises it has made at the election, but it is a serious threat to the sustainability of businesses going forward.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So I just want to visit the training issue briefly. And funny, Terry, I was on Facebook earlier, memory popped up, and it was of a story I did long before I was in the manufacturing sector. It was 6 years ago. I did a story for Share Radio when I was presenting a program there. And I interviewed the head of the EEF training center. And we were talking about apprenticeships, and we're talking about all kinds of issues around that. And I was saying what a great initiative that was. And of course, EEF is an industry body, Make UK now, of course, leading the way on apprenticeship training and so on. And there were far more applications than there were places. I think it was something like 8,000 applications for 350 places. The problem was that of the 350 they took in, only about 30 of them actually had the proper educational qualifications, basic qualifications, because they'd come out of school inadequately trained. Now, this is a roundabout way of saying that Bob Gibbon, present on this call, and I had a conversation on LinkedIn this week about the degree to which we rely, or business relies, says, come on, government, give us the people we need. And Bob was effectively saying, pardon me if I'm paraphrasing you incorrectly, Bob, he was saying, why don't we take full responsibility for this ourselves, get it all in order. We've got the resources, we've got brilliant people out there who can train and lead these things, and follow the lead of those many companies who are already setting up their own internal academies because they just despair of getting the right people coming out of further education colleges and schools. Bob, did I do you justice there? And if so, please say yes. If not, put me right.
I think the point is that even small SMEs that I've gone and visited through TMX and so forth, there's loads of them have taken the responsibility to develop their people from apprenticeships all the way through. You know, it's a core part when you want to get into TMX People and Skills Award. It covers a whole range of elements, which is all about, you know, skills, people development, career development, as well as the well-being side and so forth. So I think if I put that into context of the conversation that's gone on so far, and you know, I have a very peculiar perspective on government in the sense that I don't trust them greatly, and therefore I would always personally, any business I worked in and with would suggest look after yourself. Yeah, so I come from a physician heal thyself perspective. What you would hope government would do is what people have mentioned already now, which is infrastructure. It is education, skills development, and so forth. And it is the thing that Richard mentioned, which is creating a sense of belonging. If you don't create a sense of belonging within a country, then how the heck are you going to expect people to step up, you know, and do things way above and beyond? That's essentially what leadership is. So if you've got a whole industry that doesn't feel like it belongs, it's not believed in, it's not acknowledged and accepted, then there is an obvious failure in leadership there. I mean, in the challenges we have as a country, I guess, wouldn't we want to gather everybody in and say, we're all in it together, you know, let's get on with it. And then the other part of leadership, which is why the environment bit that Richard's talked about and John talked about, infrastructure and training, is leadership is about empowering people to get on and do it, which is where my bit about physician heal thyself is, but they're also about helping get rid of the roadblocks that get in the way. And that's something I guess we're not seeing. So we're not seeing the infrastructural stuff, the support stuff that creates stuff, and we're not seeing the roadblocks being got out of the way. However, having said that, coming back to the physician heal thyself bit, we have on these programs over the last 12 months or whatever it is, we've seen people come on and share with us things about how you can get more value out of your supply chain, how you can get more value out of your own business through lean, how you can get more value through your business through last week's scaling up and so forth. There's a huge potential in the vast majority of businesses to do far, far, far better than we currently do. That doesn't need government, that needs leadership in the businesses. That's my bit about physician heal thyself. So business leaders have a responsibility to do better. Government has a responsibility in all the contexts that people have talked about, environment, infrastructure, and skills development, to help limit the roadblocks that get in the way. I don't know whether that speaks to it, but that is really summarizing the perspectives I picked up this evening.
Mm-hmm.
Did that cover what you wanted, what you were talking about, or have I gone off on a tangent? I apologize.
No, I think I'm going to partly summarize that, if I may. Very interesting point, and I think British business leaders have come out of the pandemic more capable, wiser, more experienced, and better than they went into the pandemic. And that, of course, is through a degree of necessity, a degree of compulsion. But I think physician heal thyself is quite a valid concept here. Perhaps we need more of them to have done that through the pandemic. But there's some stellar examples of people through this force of compulsion, whether it's been finding other markets, when markets in the EU became harder through administration to target, whether it be supply chains, quite frankly, stopped being supply chains through freight costs and or other logistic difficulties, But yes, many of our businesses have proved their worth through the pandemic. Have enough done so, Nick? An open question.
Well, I think we're touching on a really interesting thing here. It is about what goes back to what you said, Terry, about that from the German central banker. It talks about, and it's about that self-image and about that confidence. And I think you're right. I think people do feel a bit more bullish about their prospects. And I think that if Mr. Johnson and his cabinet had adopted a more neutral tone and perhaps been, more along the lines of what Theresa May, Greg Clark et al. Were doing until 2019, then I think there'd be a real surge of confidence. There'd be a wave to capitalize on. But it's almost as if we've come out of the pandemic and been confronted with the spectacle of speeches like Mr. Johnson's today. And people are saying, to use an online acronym, WTAF, because it's just, it's it may be what prompts businesses further to do what Bob says. When you think about the marches, I'm going to get it wrong, but I think it's the Marches College of Technology in Shropshire, which a lot of businesses have put a lot of time and energy into creating their own college, their own technical college. You get the idea that it is possible. It is entirely possible to do this. It's just that businesses need to collaborate and see common interest, can solve common problems if they get together and talk about it and come up with solutions that work. Plenty of good companies out there already doing this, who would, people like Gripple, but many, many more, who'd be more than happy to share their experience, because it's a very virtuous cycle and a virtuous circle to be part of. So yeah, I'm actually with Bob all the way on that. I think I still agree with a comment that John made in the in the comments that it's great, but there are elements such as FE colleges which are outside a business's sphere of control. Oddly enough, this government is putting a very large amount of money into FE colleges. It'll take a while for the benefit of that to filter through, but I do hope that businesses really do their best to exert their influence over how the colleges run. A quick anecdote from a good friend of many of ours, Laura McBrown at GMB Electronics. She put some apprentices through her local FE college. And at the end of the year, one of the apprentices came up to her and said, "I'm not sure I quite understand, miss, because they're now asking me to come back as a lecturer next year." And jaw-dropping, as you can imagine, it's clear that FE colleges have been very seriously underfunded, but it doesn't mean to say that without a good dose of investment, which the Johnson government is doing, to their credit, that can't be rectified. But businesses, I really do think, Physician Healed herself, really excellent, Bob, and I think there's so much more. And when we finally get the community site up and running as of next year, hopefully December, January, this will be something we can really push at a community sector-wide level. A quick note, Stephen Barrs, I know he's on public transport because we chatted earlier today, and he's made a comment. Speaking with manufacturers, I sense Brexit is history. Yeah, I think you're right. There's no going back, not for a long time yet. And indeed, I don't know if that debate, let's call it over for now. Levelling up feels like levelling down. Key issue of trust in a government that still needs to commit to long-term industrial strategy, targeting value for the economy and for businesses. And of course, that's really what we're all about, is creating value that can be exported, creating value that can really add to our local communities, which is where we want the jobs to be and the jobs to stay. Richard Hagan, I know you're in Rochdale, you are deeply committed to your locality, to your local schools. And of course, the last thing you would ever want to see is talented youngsters sort of being driven by circumstance out of the Northwest to other places to go and get jobs. So this issue of locality, prosperity, and place is very important to you, I'm guessing.
Absolutely, yes. The next generation, we need to get them skilled in Rochdale, for Rochdale, and we definitely know that they are going to migrate to more money somewhere else. So it is a case of, certainly as us as manufacturers, we need to be able to do our digital transformation, improve our brand awareness, get our prices up, and make sure that we can keep that talent in our area. What I wanted to build on is what Bob said, is with what Johnson said today, is consumers, businesses are like sheep. Market forces and new innovations are like the wolves that make them move around, and we all move to that. The governments can only put fences here and there. That's all they can do. And what they've now done is, if they're going to put national insurance up and say that manufacturers need to pay more and do this, and they put regulations in, we're going to get our taxes put over to Ireland, move out of the country, put it in shell companies. As business people, we will survive whatever. They can't contain us. Well, what they can't do is, if they don't want to support us, is expect that we're going to be working with them. And I think that has been the breakdown that we've seen in this government for the whole period, which is really, really sad.
That's a very interesting, pardon me, point, Richard. Terry, I'd like to get your view on this. I've always been skeptical about a government or any politician that says that we must create an environment for increased foreign direct investment, because I say to myself, well, why don't we create an environment where we can invest in our own future? But that aside, it does appear that other G7 countries have far more FDI than we do, that actually foreign direct investment is quite low in this country. And that speaks volumes about perhaps why people might want to or not invest in us.
Nick, I think my first comment would be, just picking up what Richard said there and Bob before him, is that we underestimated Boris Johnson. But in the run up to him becoming PM, and immediately after PM, he became PM, too few of us realised that he would get Brexit done at any cost. He was never going to get a trade and cooperation agreement with the EU. He was never going to find a solution, if it is a solution, for Northern Ireland. We were never going to roll over 67 international EU trade agreements and improve a number of them through that process of roll-on. And I think the country and we in business made the mistake of A, underestimating Boris Johnson, and B, probably alienating. Now, we were right to challenge, but without a doubt, some of the big businesses, CBI and others, alienated Boris Johnson. Therefore, there's a reconnection to be made with Boris and his team. Now, I don't think we're going to turn Boris Johnson into an industrial strategist, but the very least we can do is turn his key generals, his key cabinet ministers, into supportive industrial strategists in terms of Kwasi Kwarteng, in terms of the Treasury, in terms of the Transport Department, and so on. And that is something we all must never give up on in terms of working. FDI. We are hugely one of the biggest recipients of FDI still in the world. In 19, we're about number 2 in the world after the United States. This has, in my view, been misreported. In terms of what I think that the figure from the TU said it was, we're 0.1% of GDP of FDI in 19. That is wrong. We brought in 36 billion of foreign direct investment in 19, and that was what, 1% of GDP. My big issue with FDI is how we categorize it. So, for example, every time an overseas company comes in and buys UK industrial assets, that is counted as an element of foreign direct investment. Take away that element of buying up UK British assets, then the figure is much, much less. But by the international definition of FDI, we do very, very well. By the way, the figure in 18 was 66 billion, so almost halved into 19. The figures for 20, very difficult to even take some trend analysis analysis from any of the figures for 2020 for various reasons.
So that's really interesting. I was looking at the long...
We have a free marketeer in Kwasi Kwarteng. You, and I suspect others, have engaged with them directly and indirectly in terms of some of the recent attempts, successful attempts and stalled attempts to buy British assets. And the latest game in town is, of course, Meggitt, a key British manufacturer of not just civil, but of course defence undercarriage equipment as well. And when I look at what happened to Cobham, of course, bought by an American hedge fund, has been split into three parts, and to a degree it has been hugely asset stripped. And I could go on. I was engaged with government in the acquisition of ARM, as you well know.
Yes, it is a massive issue when, for whatever reasons, our stock exchange is hugely undervalued, and so the companies inside it are prime choice cuts for overseas private equity companies to come in and pick them up and take the flesh off their bones. Is that fair, Terry, to put it like that? And at what point does a government say enough? Is it purely an issue of national security and technologies that shouldn't go overseas, or has that bird flown?
Nick, it's an interesting one, and clearly there is regulation around key sectors such as defence, aerospace, and now ever more around energy. But let me ask you and our colleagues a question, if I may. Why is it that if an American hedge fund on a Monday offers a share price of 70, 80% more than that share price was at close of play on a Friday, that the British Board of Directors accept, for reasons that are understandable, 70% increase in the share valuation overnight? Why is it that the British Board of Directors and shareholders accept the offer when the same offer by a similar American hedge fund to a French or a German or a Dutch or any other European company will be not just challenged by government, but rejected by the shareholders? So there's got to be something in our nation's psyche, in our own perception of open market valuation, the right to invest and make a profit. But the same course of action with the same metrics around it is very different, even, of course, to some of our nations very close to us across the channel.
Doesn't that also speak to the values of that board or the values of the shareholders? And if the values of the shareholders were to look at sustainability of whatever, to create a legacy of whatever, rather than just pursue the dollar, they would also take a different perspective.
I think that is true.
I'm sorry, no, I was going to say the Meggitt thing, and I understand, it's a British company, but I forget the statistics now, but I looked it up at the time, and it was something like 70% of its sales are in the US, in US assets. So we talk about somebody buying a British company. It's a British headquartered company. It's a British owned company that owns 70% of it US assets. So when I was in business, I know it was a long time ago, and this is why I don't speak a lot about it because it's history. We went out and acquired loads of US assets, loads of European assets, and loads of Far Eastern assets. It was okay to do that then. So I struggle with people complaining about when somebody else buys our assets. When Meggitt, already 70% of their assets are US, that they've acquired in their kind of development. That to me is international business. That also, so there's two things there. One, it's international business, and two, what are the values that the shareholders and the board wish to uphold? Is it one of legacy or is it one of chase the dollar? That's their choice. I personally would prefer legacy. I personally prefer to them to have a world perspective that looks like Richard's does, as sustainability, at developing people, at diversity, equality, and all. Those are the things I would love businesses to stand for. Unfortunately, they don't. Not all of them. And that's the issue. They can choose their values. They can live by those values. And there is no government intervention to have those values shaped in any other different way.
There are in virtually every other developed economy. North America, of course, is a relatively open market and probably as close to our model as there is in the world today. But the Meggitt equivalent of the undercarriage wheel manufacturer in France, whether it's Safran and or whoever, and I generally can't remember the name, would not have accepted such an offer from Savien or whichever hedge fund it was that made the offer into France, or indeed Germany. Now, why wouldn't it have made the offer? It may not have made the offer because the requirements of the shareholders, particularly the pension funds, who tend to be very large shareholders in those businesses, have very different constitutional requirements than we have in the UK, and much of that is right. Pension trustees have a duty, but we certainly do not have anywhere near the same protective checks and balances, hurdles, if one would like to use the word, as any other developed country, with perhaps the exception of the United States. And therefore, I think my request, and that which I've written about, rightly or wrongly, is some greater appreciation of a level playing field.
Well, I guess it would be good if there were values within the nation represented by the government that did look at sustainability, that did look at humanity, that did look at this, that, and the other. That would be a wonderful thing to aspire to.
Indeed, indeed.
Goes back to that self-image thing. I had a fascinating conversation a few years ago with Sir David McMurtry, the legend who created Renishaw. And we were talking around issues like this. And he said, it's interesting, you know, if the people who own a company live in the town where the company is, they're far less likely to shut it down than if they were sitting in Michigan. We were talking about Ford and Bridgend. They're sitting in Michigan, and the stroke of a pen, they close something down in a place called Wales. And it's nothing to them what happens, it just goes. And that sense of understanding and place, and it may not be quite to the point, but I wrote a piece last year about, does anybody know you're there? And it was about the fact we've dislocated manufacturing from our locales, from our towns and cities, because by its very nature, it's had to move out of the big mills in the center of towns, so just on the outskirts, and they've gone into business parks, tailor-made, custom-made buildings. But of course, nobody knows it's there anymore. And that's largely why when people perhaps see decaying old buildings, the old mills, the dark satanic ones of yore, and they don't see the shiny, beautiful buildings, the purpose-built factories that people like Richard Hagan and Crystal Doors have in Rochdale. Maybe they do, Richard, I don't know, but I haven't been there. But you know what I mean? People don't know what's going on because it's not under their noses, and they just assume it's not there anymore. But I do think that sense of local ownership, when you've got a local owner like Richard playing such a vital and prominent part in espousing technical education, STEM education with schools, and developing some of those ideas. Bob, you were talking earlier about Alison Giddens, I think, who our friend from Atlanta, Georgia, who was talking about the virtual internship she developed during the pandemic, which Richard and others are now taking on as models to use here in the UK. So business can actually do an awful lot of this, but it does help enormously if people know that we're there, and we're there not only to help ourselves and the country, but also help local people. I'm rabbiting around in circles now. I'd be very grateful somebody to jump in, and because we're in the last 5 minutes. So I'd like to find some kind of conclusion. I want to know what people think. If we had the ear of the Prime Minister tomorrow, what would we say? Put your hands up, please. Let's just short, snappy. Let's have a say. And Stephen Barr, I know if you're still there, put something in the notes and I'll read it out.
I'm happy to make a comment if there's nothing coming, Nick.
Okay, go for it.
Let me know. I think one of my messages to the Prime Minister would be an issue of scale. And this is where I'll once again challenge with it constructively and with warmth my colleagues on this call this evening. If you can say to me that you know of one British industrial company of any scale, then I'll be surprised, because I look at Germany, Volkswagen, 100 billion turnover. Look at Siemens, 400 billion euro turnover, and I could go on. You look at the industrial giants in the UK, BAE Systems, 22 billion. You look at the mighty JLR, 23, 24 billion. And one of the great issues about allowing our assets to be purchased when they get to a Meggitt at 2 billion or an Ultra at 1 billion is that we are not generating the businesses of global scale that we need to. And as we now have 5 US businesses, technology businesses, topping the $1 trillion turnover, we really need to look at industrial strategy, just to look to create, amongst other things, scale. And scale, of course, requires many of the things that our colleagues around this metaphorical table have addressed in the last 50 minutes.
I think that's that is a very, very cogent comment. That's amazing. If you think about it, actually, Terry, if you're talking about the Prime Minister and his love of exaggeration and great florid speeches and all of that, and global Britain and all that. Well, if we're going to be a global Britain, we need companies who can fight at a global level. And perhaps we don't have them. And this could very well be an argument in very much in favor of what you're saying, that we need to have the industrial champions ready to go toe-to-toe with some of those big guys overseas. That might appeal to his sense of the dramatic, but it would also appeal very much to the well-being of the economy of this country. Listen, it's coming up to 7 o'clock. I want to thank Terry Scuoler so very much. You have been, as always, Terry, amazing this evening, but thank you for your service over many, many long years. At the Institute of Export and International Trade now, if anybody on the call wants to know anything or get some help around exports, the Institute is there to help. So please do check it out. Mention Terry's name, they'll let you right in the front door. Thank you all for being on the call tonight. Really appreciate the conversation. Stephen, thank you for joining us. I know you're on a train somewhere, but I really love it that you came on board nonetheless. And I just, of course, would like to reiterate that this is the last of the weekly Kaizen Centrals. It's the first of the monthlies. The next one is on November the 4th. He said off the top of his head, but that's it, November the 4th. So I look forward to seeing you then. And thank you all for being with us tonight. And Terry, once again, a very, very warm thank you to you for taking time out to be with us tonight.
Nick, many thanks indeed. Thank you to you and your colleagues. All the best. Thank you now.